Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines. I speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On today's show, as fears of a global food crisis continue to spike due to the war in Ukraine, climate change and rising inflation, we speak with Dr. David Meszaros, the CEO of SMARTKAS, an agricultural technology company who's building the largest smart farm in the Netherlands using AI, drones and robotics to ask about the real reasons for the food crisis, who will suffer most and why new technologies could be the solution. But can they come quickly enough? Dr. Meszaros, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, the world feels like it's at a tipping point. The UN has warned that global hunger levels are at a new record. Food prices are about 30% higher since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we've seen a significant drop in global food exports as well. Now, a few days ago, EU President Charles Michel accused Russia of using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. He says they are solely responsible for the looming crisis. What do you think? Is Russia to blame, or do the causes of the food crisis go deeper than just the war in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Absolutely not. So the Russian-Ukrainian war is what's referred to as a catastrophic event or near catastrophic event when you're talking about the food system. But I would say it's a bit of a stretch to say that they are solely to blame. I mean, we can all recall that we just had a supply chain crisis the years prior, as well as an ongoing pandemic. There are rumors of another wave reaching Europe and the MENA region soon. And we can actually turn back the clock all the way to the 1960s. So the whole issue started back then. Just interesting fun fact, ever since then, the population has more than doubled. It's actually to 2.5 times the population than it was in 1960s. However, the use of fertilizers have increased by 8 times. So that's an 800% increase. But because of the diminishing returns of the effectiveness of these fertilizers has dropped by about 95%. So I would rather say that this has been an ongoing, long expected problem that has been brewing and brewing and brewing. We never took it seriously. What I told you at the previous chat that we had is that it's like running a business without having insurance. You just hope for the best, that nothing goes awry. But then it did, and the frequency of these catastrophic events is just increasing.
But certainly Russia still has a big part to play. You spoke there about fertilizers. Now, Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers, and Russia and Ukraine responsible for about 30% of global wheat supplies, about 70% of sunflower oil as well. Now, in your experience, I know you've consulted with governments all over the world when it comes to food security. How much do you think of global food supplies are under threat at the moment? Because one of the big issues is we're seeing not only current harvests affected, but also those for several years to come.
They're under extreme stress. So this has been a huge blow, not only to the regional, but like you said yourself, to the global food supply as well. The problem is that we have increasingly relied on a outdated, very, very old, obsolete food system. This food system positions itself on the fields, on the field farming. And because of that, there is a non-renewable aspect to it. There's a continuous new need for fertilizers, whether that's phosphorus or nitrogen or potassium based fertilizers. There is still a need for it. And you cannot just expect the food system to switch in a matter of weeks or months. And that's why people are seeing this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, this war, as this massive trigger that finally made us realize that the current unsustainable and non-renewable system just cannot continue. We're going to run out of food within the next decade or so.
So within the next decade ago, so you're saying we're going to see big challenges, big problems. How much do you think of the world's global food supplies are currently in danger at the moment, driven by the supply chain disruptions we spoke about, the pandemic, but also because of the crisis in Ukraine?
Without serious change to the food system itself, and as well as the value chain and the supply chain, it is in a critical state. Now, the good thing is that we see very, very positive reactions from European countries, from the US as well, and from China as well, depending on how you look at it. Do you look at it as positive from the Chinese population side or positive from a global perspective? But the countries and the governments are reacting to this. I would say if there is no change, then in the next 5 to 10 years, we reach critical levels, almost irreversible levels. But companies such as ours have certain solutions for so-called controlled environment agriculture, whereby partially or fully we can mitigate the effects of these catastrophic events.
And of course, governments are dealing with it in different ways. We've seen countries like India, Indonesia, they've come under a lot of flack in recent weeks. They've been criticized for banning the export of wheat and sunflower oil as well. Do you think they did the right thing in doing this? Because how do we convince governments that obviously securing their own food supplies needs to be essential, but how do we make sure that we're not enacting trade protectionism?
Well, I tend to agree with those governments because their utmost priority should be about, protecting their own population and their own people. It's more in the way how they set up that structure in the past few decades that poses a threat. I am not in favor of trade protectionism. However, I am heavily against import and export because then that raises another issue with climate change and the emissions related to that. What I would suggest as a solution is that each and every single becomes food producer and relying on their own food supplies, especially when it comes to fruits and vegetables.
But that's obviously a long-term solution as well. I'm interested to hear that you agree with countries like India and Indonesia who have restricted these food supplies, because as the saying goes, an eye for an eye and the whole world ends up blind. So securing your own sources has to be important, but how do we make sure that the world still has access to this essential food items if we don't have the necessary strategy in place yet?
So there is a difference between policy forming and enacting that policy on a global level and producing your own food. What I'm advocating for is that every single country in the world should adopt a certain level of agricultural technology that enables them to produce their own food. Should another pandemic come around, another war or whatever catastrophic event, that they are not forced and reliant on another country and forced to trade with them. You might remember what happened with the UAE when the pandemic has started. The UAE very cleverly has been stockpiling food and then very funny, a UAE that doesn't really produce a lot of food, actually imports more than 90% of its food, has become an exporter in the region to help. And that's very, very nice. We should help each other. We should collaborate between the countries. There should be cross-border trade. What I'm advocating for is that we should reduce import-export as much as possible by enabling those countries, by enabling the governments to produce fresh fruits and vegetables on a massive scale that feeds their own population. But there's a difference between having, variety and luxury goods or certain soft fruits that are consumed for passion and not for the caloric intake. Those should be imported, exported. Definitely, there should be global trade. I'm just saying that the basic caloric intake of every single country should be produced within that country.
So it does seem like the world is overly reliant on a number of exporting food countries as well. You're saying that diversification is essential. Are governments open to this change? Are they ready for that change?
Absolutely. Actually, our entire business model is centered around governments. So we're not a B2C or a B2B company. We're not going out there and marketing ourselves and saying like, hey, buy what I'm selling. No, not at all. We actively, proactively reach out to governments and ask, what are you struggling with? What are you importing at this moment? And then we make the conscious decision without fighting with the local smallholder farmers to produce those goods that they are importing at that given time. And because we can reach hundreds and hundreds of, more yield, more kilograms per target area than traditional farming, governments are responding to this very, very positively.
Now, you've consulted with governments worldwide in food security. You've led 43 projects in the EU previously. How do you think the risks of this disruption compare with previous food emergencies? And how do you think this crisis in Ukraine will change the food and agriculture industry longer term?
So the problem with the European Union is that they are very much trend followers. They're not the trend setters. I am a European, so I speak against myself. But whatever happens in the US, in Russia, in some cases China, sooner or later reaches Europe, and then we follow that trend. And Europe tends to have a very, very short memory. So whenever there's a catastrophic event, a few years later, they do as if nothing else happened, and they go back to those same fossilic, non-renewable sources of energy, food, seeds, fertilizer, and so on and so forth. So I think what should happen is at the macro level, the highest level, so union level, Commission, European Commission level, there should be new policies that are not only supporting, but also mandating new kind of technologies to be introduced to the oldest industry known to mankind, agriculture and food production.
So it feels like too much talk, not enough action at the moment. Let's focus on this part of the world, for the Middle East as well. What does all of this mean for the MENA region? Because countries like Egypt and Tunisia, they import about 80% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and Lebanon, it's about 60%. And as we know, one of the big underlying reasons for the Arab Spring some years ago was food insecurity. So how much of a risk, how much of a concern is it for this part of the world?
So the entire MENA region is very, very close to my heart. I've worked and lived there for many, many years. I still work with a lot of very, very prolific families, especially in the GCC countries. But we have received requests from Tunisia and Morocco this year to go over there. So I would say that the technologies that we are using and companies like ours provide are the best used in these countries. So the contrast is just huge. You know, when you introduce vertical farming or automated robotic farming into the Netherlands, which is already, you know, a pioneer in agriculture, sure, you see increases, you see incremental increases, 20, 30, 40, 50%. But when you introduce it to a desert or near desert like region, then you're looking at hundreds, if not thousands of multipliers compared to their traditional agriculture. So far the reaction and the response has been overwhelming, very, very, very positive, and rightfully so. This is the kind of technology that can enable them to grow their own food without relying on either Europe or Asia, Southeast Asia for imports, whether we're talking about seeds, fertilizers, pure food, or even labor.
Okay, but again, long-term solutions. What about today? What are some of the potential risks or threats we could be looking at from the crisis between Ukraine and Russia? How is that affecting the MENA region today as it stands?
If we're talking about today, if we're talking about the next few weeks, there's a huge impact for them. Obviously, their strong reliance on imported wheat, imported rice, all kinds of grains, the fertilizers themselves, on that what little land they have to propagate and farm on that, it is completely disrupting their economy, especially the agroeconomy. And there is no other choice by the government than to use brute force, as in buy food at an increased price to try to, you know, satiate the demand for food by the population. I would say that it's not too late. We haven't reached that critical moment yet that we referred to earlier, that comes in 5 to 10 years. If they make the conscious decision to switch now, as in this year, really now, then within the next 6 to 12 months, we could see the appearance of smart farms powered by whatever natural resources they have, in this case, mostly solar, and then producing their own food. But yes, it's been a critical blow that they suffered from this conflict.
And we have seen some other options, some other avenues explored by governments in this part of the world. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they've been trying to secure their food supplies for some time. They've been investing in farms abroad, often in Africa. Likewise, we saw the US invest in farms in Mexico as well, because it was much cheaper. Do you think this is a viable, sustainable solution, or does it only work for those who are rich?
I wouldn't make the difference between rich or poor. I would say it's not a sustainable solution because of the nature of humankind, because of the current volatile geopolitical situation overall in the whole world, globally speaking. I wouldn't advise a government to place their food production in a foreign land. I would strongly advise that they keep that which is most precious, should be most precious, more precious than oil, than gold, than even data, at hand within their own lands.
Well, the FAO says the world needs to readjust its food portfolio. They say we've become too reliant on food sources like rice, maize, and wheat. This is something you've mentioned as well. Now, these make up around half of our daily calorie intake. Now, there are ongoing concerns as well about the greenhouse gas emissions from the meat industry. So we know what we need to do, but is it realistic to expect countries to change what's on their tables so drastically?
I think it's absolutely realistic. It's just that the communication needs to be done in a proper way. What I also told you during our orientation discussion is that having 200, 300, 400 pages long white papers drafted is no use for the population, is no use for the public. You're not going to readjust or make them rethink their dietary needs based on these long, boring, monotone studies. You have to go with the trends. You have to use social media. You have to use, movies, documentaries to essentially make them realize that there are better ways that do not go at the expense of your economic situation. You do not necessarily have to pay more, but there are conscious choices. This can be done both on a micro level and a macro level. The micro level is more influencing, to use a trendy word from our era, the actual people to consume more fruits and vegetables and less meat. I am myself a meat eater, so I'm not a vegan or vegetarian, but it should be possible. However, from a macro level, there's fun fact, if you introduce just 3 to 5% seaweed into the diet of cattle, into cows, they reduce their methane emissions by 80-85%. There's been a study done on this in Australia, published in the Time a few years ago. And this can be and should be implemented by governments because it doesn't come with an extra cost component. It's just a win-win scenario. So we should look at these kind of solutions, whether it's the production of fruits and vegetables, whether it's the more sustainable production and treatment of cattle, or simply rethinking and readjusting our entire way of life. That's up to each individual government and each individual culture to define for themselves. But there are so many solutions to pick from that every single country should find their own.
Okay, so who do you think is most guilty of writing these long, boring papers that you mentioned before? I know you've criticized the FAO quite a bit previously for having these 500 long white pages that we need to see more of an impact in everyday lives. So how do we go about trying to feed the population without destroying the climate? Because I know there's even big concerns about the poultry industry as well that you've previously raised.
Absolutely. So I would say that just on the criticism part, I would say that it's not directly the FAO's fault. They work based on a mandate from the United Nations. I would say that the whole system is broken in a sense that people who are making the decisions, the rules, the directives for the population are the tendencies that they happen to be older people, more senior people.
So who's that? Who is to blame? If it's not the FAO, who are the people you're talking about making decisions? You're talking about governments or international bodies?
Yes, I would say governments. I would definitely say governments, international bodies, international organizations. They try their best. They usually approach from an expert, from a professional perspective, whereas governments approach from a political perspective. So there's a difference between meaning well and using well-researched, academically based data to improve the situation, and there's a difference between what sounds nice, what is easy to sell.
Okay, so give me an example. Which governments are getting it right currently, and which governments are getting it wrong?
I would say, so I just came back from Brazil. I met with the municipality level, the federal state level, and as well as the big federal level in the capital. I met with 3 ministers, the agriculture, the technology, and the economic development. I think that they are getting it right. Maybe they didn't get it right in the past few decades, but right now, this year and going forward, they're definitely getting it right. Contrary to popular belief, they very much care about the rainforest. They very much care about their public image, but there's just a disconnect between what Europe, US, and other regions of the world think about them. So I think by combining technology with a new way of supply chain management, as well as introducing a more rich diet to the population, and doing this in a kind of trendy influencer, direct social media communication way, that's the way to go. Because, the younger the generations need to be addressed, the more you have to sorry for the lack of better word, but dumb it down, make it easy, make it snappy and short, and that's a good example, I would say.
Do you think, I guess, in some ways, it feels like the rapid transformation and digital push that we saw during the pandemic? Do you think something like that is going to happen from the current food crisis? Is that going to have an influence on global food supply to perhaps introduce a more sustainable way of sourcing our food?
100%. That's exactly what we do as well. We drive something called a data-driven economy or data-driven agriculture, whereby you need to analyze every single component, not just what the plants do or what happens inside, but also what happens outside. You know, the agroeconomy, the geopolitical conditions, prices, and not only prices of seeds and fertilizer, but also, you know, power prices, transport costs, etc., etc. I think in that the UAE is also a front runner because they are leading in a way of digitalizing their country, and they're taking huge leaps.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your work, because I know you're a big advocate of autonomous smart farms as well. Tell me a little bit about some of the work you've been doing. You've been creating the Netherlands' largest autonomous smart farm over there at the moment. Tell me about exactly how that works.
So what we do is, imagine it like this. You have a farm field. You try to grow strawberries on it. Usually you have a yield of 10 to 50 metric tons on 1 hectare. 1 hectare is 10,000 square meters. On the same amount of land, when a 10 or 12 layer vertical farm is built by SMARTKAS, is my company, we can grow there above 2,000 metric tons. So approximately 200 times more high quality, pesticide free, and sustainably grown fresh strawberries. Not only that, but those are grown 24/7. So from the 1st of January until 31st of December, and they're grown right next to the city where they're sold. So just to repeat, 200 times more yield. It's grown sustainably. So we're recirculating the water. We're using solar or wind or whatever energy is possible for us. And this is grown all pesticide free and sold locally. So we are basically cutting out the middleman. There's no import, there's no export, and just, you know, amounts of by orders of magnitude higher amounts. Right now I'm based here. I'm here in the Amsterdam location, but we also have a location in London. We have a R&D facility in Hungary, and we're building a massive greenhouse in Brazil.
But I think one of the big concerns about smart farms is they're often criticized for only growing microgreens and food that just is not going to sustain the population. What about SMARTKAS? Are you able to grow things currently like potatoes? You know, some of those are more carb-heavy staples.
That's a very, very fair criticism, and I am happy to stand in the line of those criticizers. But one should remember as well that this is an evolution.
Is that a yes or a no? What type of
It's a yes. That's a straight
so
yes.
So you are growing potatoes, or what are you growing today?
We are not growing potatoes, but there are other vertical farms, indoor farms that are growing potatoes. So the technology exists, but there's a big but. Whether that's economically feasible and whether you're going to make profits out of that's still a no.
So what are you growing today then?
Anything that grows in a greenhouse. So tomatoes, bell peppers, aubergine, beans, even you can grow easily. Obviously the lettuce, microgreens, leafy greens, what you've alluded to, that's level 1, that everybody can do that. But any type of soft fruits, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries. We also have research going on, active research on vanilla and saffron. And we also are looking into rice and soy next year. The rice and soy we actually want to deploy in Brazil to not only have an indirect protection of the rainforest, but a very, very direct. Look at this, we can grow 200 times more soy, or, you know, the research hasn't finished yet, so I don't know exactly how much more in this plot of land. So you don't have to cut down that much more rainforest.
Okay, but vanilla and saffron not going to feed those hungry populations in parts of Africa anytime soon. I know you are looking at creating a mega farm for several countries across the GCC. How have you progressed in that? Which countries have signed up? What about investors? I know a couple of years ago you signed an agreement with Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Nahyan. That was back in July 2020. Is he a part of this? Who is taking part so far?
He's not a part of this anymore. That was an early attempt at a joint venture. It went pretty well, but then we had different opinions about how to run this project. Essentially, we are discussing not only with UAE government officials and sheikhs, royal families, but also in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia, because what we believe in is that, especially for the GCC countries, we could build one massive mega facility, as you have also kindly alluded to, and that one facility run completely sustainably, completely autonomously, using only renewable sources of energy and water, could feed these three countries. And we imagine it in a triangle format, where one equal piece of the triangle would be in one of the three countries. And by introducing autonomous electric vehicles, trucks, essentially, supplying then the largest cities of these three countries with fresh fruits and vegetables.
So one mega farm, I mean, it sounds like something out of the movie. It sounds absolutely fascinating. What are the costs involved in creating something like this? And does having just one joined smart farm, does that not contradict a little bit about what you said earlier about being able to diversify and be able to produce your food, but get it from multiple sources?
It doesn't contradict it, because we're not talking about necessarily little countries. When you look at, for example, the Benelux, where I come from, you have the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but essentially they're such small countries that even considered, you push them together, you still don't have the largest state of Germany, for example. So going back to the GCC countries, because they're so tightly wrapped around each other, and they are already trading with each other. It's essentially one block, one region that we could handle as one, same climate. You can have then bilateral treaties around trade, etc., etc. So that's why we want to choose for one. There's another reason, is because the population of the entire GCC is about 52 million people. On the entire peninsula, 85 million people live. So there is no point in building 3, 5, or 10 smart farms, whether small or big, because in essence, you're not supplying that many people, and seeing the bigger scope of things.
But I mean, the UAE and Qatar obviously had some political tensions years ago. It seems like it would make more sense to be able to diversify food a little bit rather than having just one central location. What if the power goes down? What if there's a problem? We hear cyber attacks all over the world these days. If we've got one unit, surely that can come under threat.
That's definitely a good point. And that's why I said that we would have 3 legs of this farm, and then it would be exactly based on the tri-border. And, you would have one leg reaching into one country, and the other leg into the other, and then the third leg into the third country. The reason for being all at the same point, because then we can pick the most ideal position from a climate perspective, from a power line perspective, from a water perspective, and so on and so forth. Plus, earlier you asked, the costs involved with this would be around $1 billion, 900 to 1.1 billion dollars. It would produce about 50,000 tons of fresh fruits and vegetables, which according to our studies would be more than enough for the fresh fruit and vegetable supply for these countries.
And how do you do that? What type of energy? Is it a desal plant or renewable energy? How are you being able to power this huge greenhouse smart farm?
So most of the energy would have to be used as electrical energy, not as heat energy, thermal energy, because obviously we are in a very, very warm part of the world. We would rely heavily on solar, but even during the construction of a massive solar plant, we could use fossil fuels, but very sustainably. Sustainable source of energy doesn't always mean that it needs to be renewable immediately from the onset. We can have a transition period, but that's the energy part. On the water, I would use solar. I would heavily use solar, because sun is not in short supply in these countries. Land is available and you can utilize it. And there are newer and newer technologies in PV panels, some elevated, some transparent. We are also experimenting with transparent PVs, which then allow for even more energy generation per target area. And then in the case of, sand, you have to clean it. We have technologies that are automated robots, strings, drones that are cleaning these panels regularly without human intervention. So that's what we would do on the power side. And then you quickly asked about the water side. There are 2-3 solutions for this. Number one, because the systems themselves are hermetically closed, anything from humidity to evaporation to direct irrigation, spillage, we can recycle. Now, of course, the recycling will not be perfect. We will have some losses. Plus, also you have the losses through the fruits and vegetables that leave, the greenhouses, the units. So we would introduce two water capture units. One would be a desalination plant, and the other one would be an atmospheric water generation unit, which captures the humidity from the air. And alongside the coastline, we have already checked, we've done on-site studies on this. There's just enough humidity in the air to capture between 4,000 to 6,000 liters of water per unit per day.
Okay, just quickly, because we're almost out of time. When are we expecting this mega farm to be up and running? Have any investors signed on yet?
We already have investors signed on. We are talking to, like I said, royal families from all three countries, but we're also talking to European investors and European public entities. We expect to finish the early stage development, pre-engineering and designs in the next 2 years. And then afterwards, we can talk about construction. So definitely not in the next 2 years, probably 3-4 years is when we can see signs of this project.
Okay, so no quick fixes. Final question for you. If the world keeps carrying on as it is today, can the world really feed the global population of 10 billion people that's forecast by 2050 with our current food system?
The world can feed 10 billion people, but not with the current food system.
Okay, so what needs to be the top strategy? What needs to be the first steps to put this in place?
The first is to cut the reliance on fertilizers and inefficient farming methods. We have assigned certain numbers to every single country. So not every country needs to have an autonomous, AI run farm. You can start small. You can use drones to better divide the pesticides. Then you can use certain foil technologies, polytunnel technologies, what Spain uses, Morocco uses to protect the crops. And then slowly every single country can transition. But in essence, using technology and innovative solutions is the key towards providing food security in the world.
Oh, well, let's hope some of those changes come about quickly. Dr. Meszaros, thank you very much for your time and for joining us on Frankly Speaking.
Thank you for having me.